Welcome back to Unseen Rite, where the shadows whisper truths the world was never meant to remember. Tonight, we step into the icy depths of post-war America, into a town tucked so deep in the Appalachian Hills, even its sins couldn't find their way out. Havenwood, West Virginia, 1948. A town of coal dust and God-fearing folk, where the doctor knew your bloodline and the sheriff knew your secrets. But beneath the polished wood pews and the smiles of Sunday service, something else lived, something that made birth and death indistinguishable. Before we continue the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these dark historical mysteries. Tell us in the comments below, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our viewers across America. The Hemlock scheme, the funeral home that sold babies to the elite, 1948, West Virginia. A respected doctor, a trusted mortician, a subterranean corridor linking a maternity ward to a funeral home, and over 200 babies who were never buried because they were never really dead. Let's begin. Dr. Alistair Hemlock came to Havenwood in the spring of 1946, dressed in fine wool and war medals. He brought modernity, vaccines, clean birth beds, and a smile that softened suspicion. His brother Silas, already the town mortician, had quietly handled the dead for decades. Together they founded the Hemlock Foundation for Appalachian Health. It promised life, healing, mercy, but it delivered something else entirely. By 1948, nearly every birth in Havenwood took place under their care. Women trusted the white-tiled rooms and calming hymns on phonographs. But if you stepped one floor too low, you entered silence. There, hidden behind a storage door and an intercom switch labeled "Authorized Only," was a corridor. Cold, soundproofed, climate-controlled, connecting where life began to where it was meant to end. And through that corridor, healthy newborns vanished, traded like currency. Poor mothers were told their babies were stillborn. Wealthy families were offered miracle adoptions. Death certificates were forged, grief was staged, and no one questioned it. Because the Hemlocks were trusted. Because no one suspects the man who handles your grief to be the one who caused it. Stay with us. What comes next is the unraveling of one of the most chilling institutional betrayals in American history. And it began with a nurse who finally stopped looking away. Her name was Eleanor Vance, a war widow, a registered nurse, and a woman with too many questions for her own safety. She arrived in Havenwood in January 1952, hired to assist with deliveries at the Hemlock maternity ward. Quiet, observant. She didn't speak much, but she noticed everything. The first thing that struck her: the silence. Not just the reverent quiet of a small-town hospital, but a deliberate, watchful kind of silence. Nurses spoke in clipped tones, paperwork vanished before it could be reviewed, and the mothers, most, never got to hold their babies. They were sedated for their own good, told their infants had congenital failures, told to forget to pray to heal. But Eleonora had seen war. She'd watched blood bloom through gauze and life slip away on cold metal tables. She knew what death looked like and what it didn't. One night, a 17-year-old named Lottie Brewer came in screaming far too early. Her hands clutched her belly as if trying to keep the child inside. Eleonora helped deliver a boy, small but breathing, kicking, crying. She left the nursery for less than 15 minutes. When she returned, the crib was empty. Nurse Agnes Blackwood, older, composed, and always one step behind Dr. Hemlock, handed her a chart. "Stillbirth," it read. Eleonora froze. "That's not possible," she whispered. Agnes didn't blink. "You're new here. Best you learn how things are done." That moment lit a fuse. In the weeks that followed, Eleonora began documenting every birth and death. She recorded times, weights, even the angle of a mother's body when she last held her child. What she uncovered was impossible to dismiss. Babies listed as dead hours before complications began, death certificates issued without physicians ever seeing the body. And always the same signature at the bottom, Dr. A. Hemlock. Still, she kept quiet. She pretended to follow orders, pretended to believe, but beneath her calm eyes a storm was gathering. One night after a delivery, she followed Nurse Blackwood, through the surgical wing, past the old storage freezer, down a hallway marked for maintenance. There, hidden behind a metal door with no handle, was a switch. Agnes flipped it. The door hissed. A corridor emerged, sterile, dimly lit, humming cold. What Eleanor saw next would end her life as she knew it. The corridor was silent, too silent. Eleanor's shoes barely made a sound as she stepped into the dim, humming passageway. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, jerking shadows on the tiled floor. The walls were thick, padded, and painted an industrial gray, like an asylum built underground. It didn't smell like a hospital anymore. It smelled wrong. Cold metal, preserved flesh, formalin, and silence. At the end of the hallway was a heavy door, unmarked. She waited, heart pounding in her ears, and watched Nurse Blackwood unlock it with a key she wore beneath her blouse. Eleanor couldn't follow then. Too risky. But now she knew. There was more beneath Havenwood than anyone was meant to see. The next day, she found the floor plans in the town archives, buried under utility records and forged inspection logs. No such corridor existed on any official document. The funeral home and maternity ward were listed as separate buildings, but Eleanor traced the plumbing, the wiring, the ventilation systems. They all met beneath the foundations. She returned the following night. With shaking hands and a stolen maintenance key, she entered alone. Beyond the heavy door, the corridor opened into a windowless chamber. Climate-controlled, sterile, filled with surgical tables and refrigeration units. On one gurney lay a baby, pale and unmoving. Next to it, another, breathing softly, eyes darting beneath translucent lids. Two identical forms, but only one would be recorded. Stacked beside the wall were ledger books, worn and handwritten. She flipped through them in disbelief. Each line was a transaction. Infant M, 7 Lidby 20s, delivered 117, healthy, transfer initiated. Replacement secured. 118, DC, cardiac anomaly. No names, only initials, weights, conditions, sale prices in the margins. Infants weren't dying, they were being erased, replaced, sold. And worse still, some were being bred, born to vanish, engineered disappearances for a network that stretched far beyond Havenwood. Suddenly a noise, a hiss of hydraulics. Someone was coming. Eleanor fled through a side hall and emerged into the funeral home's embalming suite, where Silas Hemlock was working on a child-sized corpse. The body bore no scars, no trauma, just pale perfection and the silent sorrow of being chosen to die in another's place. She stumbled backward, bile rising in her throat. Silas didn't even look up. He simply whispered, "You should not be here." And in that instant, Eleanor knew two things. One, this was bigger than she imagined. Two, she would never leave Havenwood alive unless she exposed every rotten piece of it. She didn't sleep that night. Who could? Eleanor sat on the floor of her tiny apartment, the stolen ledger open on the table like a cursed book, pages filled with infant codes, cryptic medical notations, and hidden identities. Each line was a lie. Each lie had a mother, and each mother believed their baby was gone forever. She couldn't stop thinking about the breathing infant on the table, the one whose mother would be handed a cold body, swaddled and lifeless. A death that never happened, only orchestrated, recorded, and sealed in silence. That's when the patterns started to emerge. Eleanor began comparing dates from the birth announcements in the Havenwood Herald with the official death records in the county registrar. What she found defied logic and decency. A family in the hills lost a baby girl on March 3rd. Pneumonia within the first hour, the certificate said. A wealthy banker's wife gave birth to a girl on March 4th. Miracle recovery after late-stage complications. Same weight, Same length, same exact birthmark in the published photo. Eleanor's hands shook. It wasn't a coincidence, it was inventory management. She dug deeper, matching babies from poor families declared dead within hours to healthy miracle births among Havenwood's elite. Some born on the same day, within the same hour. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a supply chain. For decades, Havenwood had been a quiet place, an obedient town. People trusted the Hemlocks because they were always there, at births, at deaths. They baptized and embalmed, delivered and buried. They didn't run the town, they owned it. Then came the next name in the ledger, Agnes Blackwood. Her signature appeared beside dozens of entries. She wasn't just complicit, she was coordinating sedatives, record alterations, nurse scheduling, disappearances. And somehow no one noticed, or worse, some did. Because Sheriff Brody's signature was stamped across stillborn paperwork dozens of times. He wasn't just dismissing Eleanor's concerns, he was part of it. And that realization hit like ice in the spine. There was no one to report this to. Not the police, not the mayor, not the church council. They all had their hands on the wheel of the machine. And when a machine is this well-oiled, the only way to stop it is to jam yourself into its gears. But first, she had to know everything, every infant, every lie, every room. Because beneath Havenwood wasn't just a secret corridor. It was a factory for invisible grief, and it had been running for years. The walls of the Hemlock Foundation began to breathe with secrets Eleanor could no longer ignore. By day, she walked the sterile white halls like every other nurse, smiling, steady, complicit in appearance. But beneath her uniform, Eleanor was unraveling, strand by strand. The charts didn't lie, and neither did the eyes of grieving mothers whose cries always ended too quickly. There was something wrong in Havenwood, something ancient masquerading as modern medicine. She began keeping her own notes, quietly, carefully, in the back of a gardening journal, cross-referencing birth dates with death notices, watching how Nurse Blackwood always controlled the schedules, how every poor mother was drugged for pain before being told their baby never made it. The euphemisms were endless: silent lungs, congenital failure, genetic fragility. But Eleanor had held those babies. She'd felt life in them, and then nothing. Then came the shift that broke her. July 9th, 1952, a healthy boy was born to a 16-year-old named Lydia Harrow. Strong heartbeat, good lungs. Eleanor cradled him herself, but just 2 hours later, the chart read, stillbirth, respiratory failure. She confronted Dr. Alistair, but his expression was colder than usual, clinical, detached. "Not all are meant for this world," he said without looking up from his notes. That same night, Eleanor wandered into the lower wing looking for answers, and she found one. Behind a supply closet that never opened, hidden behind a panel of false drawers, was a corridor, soundproofed, tiled like an embalming suite. It smelled of bleach and something far older, a hallway that should never exist in a maternity ward. Yet there it was, lights low, silence complete. At the end of it, double doors marked with nothing but a brass emblem of a weeping willow. She didn't enter that night, she couldn't, but she knew. And in that moment, Eleanor Vance understood what the Hemlock brothers were doing. They weren't just burying the dead, they were trafficking the living. And Havenwood was the auction house. What she did next would decide whether she vanished like the others or exposed a legacy of rot buried beneath America's smiling face. The question was no longer if the town was in on it. It was how deep the roots of the hemlock tree truly went. It began with a whisper, a half-burned ledger left behind in a locked drawer. Eleanor returned to the corridor 2 nights later. This time, she came with gloves, a flashlight, and the quiet fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. The hallway led her beneath the funeral home, cold, clinical, and worse. Prepared. The floor sloped down, and the silence became suffocating. She found stainless steel counters and baby blankets, folded like linen napkins. No smell of death, just emptiness, sanitized horror. Inside a rusted file cabinet, she found it. The ledger. Silas Hemlock's handwriting. Meticulous. Ink faded but legible. Names, dates, weights, prices, infant transfers. Buyers listed by code. CH17, ATL12, NY03. Some had stars beside them. Others were simply marked repeat. In total, over 200 names. And then, buried halfway through, a phrase underlined 3 times. Bloodline acquisition confirmed. No trace. Mother sedated. Her hands shook. This was no longer about one town or even one state. This was systemic, hidden in plain sight behind pillars of trust, hospitals, churches, local government. She snapped photographs, wrapped the ledger in wax paper and slipped out before dawn. But someone saw her. The next morning, Eleanora's apartment door was ajar. Her medical bag rifled through. No note, no warning, just a single pink hospital bracelet on her pillow, labeled Lydia Harrow, infant male, in red ink. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. She was in, and now she had a choice. Stay silent and survive, or speak out and risk everything. And this is where you come in. Comment "We do not consent" twice below to show you've made it this far, because the deeper we go, the more resistance we face. Your voice is our protection, and your awakening keeps stories like this from being buried again. Eleanora chose to fight, and what she uncovered next would tear apart not just Havenwood, but the illusion of innocence surrounding an entire nation. Eleanora's defiance sent ripples through Havenwood's carefully constructed facade. As she dug deeper, more faces emerged from the shadows. Doctors who vanished without records, nurses who disappeared overnight, families relocated with new identities. The Hemlock brothers had built a fortress of silence, protected by corrupt officials and fearful townsfolk. She found evidence that the stolen infants were trafficked across state lines, sold to elite families craving perfect bloodlines or secret heirs. Some whispered of underground clinics where these children were raised in isolation, conditioned to serve shadowy patrons. But perhaps the most horrifying discovery was the network of religious leaders who blessed these transactions. Churches complicit in sanctifying lies, baptizing stolen souls, and burying their truths in consecrated ground. Eleanora's journal filled with names and dates, but the more she wrote, the clearer it became. This was not just a local conspiracy. It was a national nightmare. She realized the Hemlock operation was just one branch of a vast, hidden system, an institutionalized cycle of exploitation wrapped in trust, obedience, and silence. Her final entry before going into hiding read, "They wear the masks of saviors betrayed in innocence, and we, the living, are the witnesses or the next victims. The question is, how long before they come for us?" As the sun set on Havenwood, Eleanora vanished. But her story, her warnings, and her courage remain. Now the question for you is this: how many shadows lie beneath the institutions you trust? And what will you do when the truth demands a price? In the months that followed Eleanora's disappearance, Havenwood transformed into a town frozen in paranoia. Those who had once smiled at church gatherings now avoided eye contact. Homes went dark earlier, and the Hemlock funeral home boarded up. Yet rumors swirled that someone still entered through the back door at night. The state issued a brief statement claiming an internal review yielded no prosecutable evidence. Officially, the Hemlock brothers were written off as rogue actors, lone wolves in a system that regrettably failed to supervise. But in private, records were sealed, reporters were threatened, and families of the missing were paid to forget. One by one, key witnesses either recanted or disappeared. Still, some remnants of the truth survived. A janitor at the Havenwood General Hospital found a sealed box in the sub-basement marked only with the number 27. Inside, birth tags, photographs, hospital bracelets, and a single cassette tape labeled Chimera. On the tape, a voice believed to be Dr. Alistair Hemlock spoke calmly. In every society, there must be those who take the burden of choice. We do not steal life, we repurpose it. The world needs symmetry, order, and most of all, ignorance. The tape was sent anonymously to a university ethics department in New York, but before it could be verified, the department's archive room caught fire. No suspects, no footage, nothing remained. And yet, whispers spread. Independent journalists began connecting cases, rural hospitals closed under mysterious circumstances, birth records inexplicably erased, funeral homes with sealed lower levels. A map slowly formed, and at its center, the same three symbols appeared in the margins of files, graffiti, and documents. A cradle, a coffin, an ancient alchemical sigil meaning hidden transformation. It was never about birth or death. It was about control, ownership, the power to rewrite human lineage behind a curtain of legitimacy. This was no isolated tragedy. It was a pattern still unfolding, still active, still protected. And if the whispers are true, Eleonora didn't vanish. She was taken, or worse, recruited. Because once you know the truth, you only have two options: expose it or join it. The last confirmed sighting of nurse Eleonora Vance came not from a police report, but from a grainy black and white security feed dated February 3rd, 1955. The location: a psychiatric facility in Wilkes County, North Carolina. She appeared in the background of a hallway frame, wearing hospital whites, pushing an empty gurney past a locked infant care ward that, officially, had been shut down a year prior. No one noticed at the time. The footage only came to light decades later, when the building was condemned and archived recordings were released to historical researchers. Eleonora's face was older, her hair streaked with gray, but the eyes, still alert, still watchful, still aware. Who had she become? Some say she was forced into silence. Others believe she went underground to gather more evidence. But a chilling theory emerged among independent investigators that Eleonora had infiltrated a much larger network. A syndicate operating behind hospitals, adoption agencies, mortuaries, and even genetic research institutions. One ex-CIA analyst described the system as a silent architecture of population engineering. The purpose? Not just trafficking infants, but shaping bloodlines, rewriting familial heritage, and experimenting with inherited traits under the guise of public health. By the 1970s, whispers of something called the Pearl Index began to circulate among whistleblowers. It wasn't a fertility metric as most believed, but rather a coded reference to a black-budget registry tracking valuable genomes. Babies selected not for who they were, but for what they could become. Eleonora's name would resurface again, attached to declassified memos stamped "Top Secret," discussing an operation titled Cradle Protocol. The authors, unnamed officials within the Department of Health and Human Services, and a private biotech firm with ties to military contractors. One memo reads, "Subjects must remain unaware of origin. Ancestral erasure is paramount. Any whistleblower exhibiting empathy towards source families is a contamination risk." Was that why Eleonora went silent? Did she get too close, or did she cross the line? By now, Havenwood had become a ghost town. The Hemlock compound was bulldozed, but the hospital blueprints showed a lower level that was never on official records. A sealed wing, no stair access, no elevator, just a tunnel, leading underground, leading somewhere. And if it's still there, untouched, what else might still be inside? By the time investigators reopened the Havenwood case in 1998, following an anonymous tip linked to a burned parcel of hospital files, the town had become a memory, and most official documents had vanished under routine purges. But one fragment survived, a maintenance logbook. Tucked inside was a faded map, and beneath it a hand-scrawled note in red ink. Room B13 never existed, that's why they never locked it. The basement blueprints, once thought incomplete, now revealed a secondary sub-level, referred to simply as Ward Theta. No one had ever filed for its construction, no permits, no funding trail, yet the layout was precise. Cryogenic storage bays, sterilization chambers, and a corridor labeled Pedigree Observation. For what? That answer came with the journal of a former orderly who worked nights during the Hemlock era. In it, he described being instructed to rotate specimens and monitor vitals of dormants. But the most disturbing entry read, "They don't age, not like us, they just sleep, some twitch, some whisper." One opened her eyes. It was dated March 17th, 1953, 4 months after that infant trafficking raid supposedly ended everything. What were the Hemlocks preserving? These weren't bodies, these were subjects, children perhaps, genetically selected, engineered or manipulated. And then came the FOIA leak from a Pentagon contractor in 2004, codenamed Project Sylvian. It detailed a 1950s-era behavioral experiment on early imprinting through controlled mourning. The idea? Infants taken from birth, flooded with artificial grief environments, loss, abandonment, trauma, then monitored for neurological evolution. The objective? To isolate emotional resilience genes and map trauma-based intelligence potential. In other words, they weren't just stealing children. They were building something, a new kind of human, one unmoored from ancestry, untethered by empathy, designed through loss to be exceptional or unbreakable. And Havenwood, it wasn't a town, it was a lab. The entire community had been a fabricated ecosystem, part of a controlled social experiment spanning generations. When the experiment failed, they buried the evidence. Literally, beneath concrete, beneath lies, beneath your history books. And as the final whisper of truth escapes that tunnel's mouth, ask yourself, how much of your life is built on grief you were meant to inherit? Are you the experiment now? What if the experiment never ended? What if the Hemlocks weren't the architects, but the curators? And what if Project Sylvian continued, quietly, invisibly, long after Havenwood vanished from maps? In 2012, a declassified Department of Energy archive referenced an operation called Nursery Echo. Buried deep in the metadata were coordinates, precise GPS markers, matching the former grounds of the Hemlock compound. According to those files, thermal anomalies were recorded there every July for 6 consecutive years. Always on the 18th, always around 3 a.m., witness logs from drone operators reported ambient crying noises in areas with no living presence. But here's where it becomes undeniable. A former nurse from the Appalachian Genetics Institute, under the condition of anonymity, revealed she had once treated a young girl who bore an internal microchip, dated 1951. The chip had no commercial manufacturer. It wasn't medical. It was a transmitter, transmitting to something. The girl had no birth certificate, no family, no legal guardianship, just a patient ID, Theta 13. Exactly the same as the unlisted corridor on that hidden floor plan. She was adopted under a closed federal program, and she had one recurring phrase she whispered in her sleep, caught on multiple hospital security recordings. They gave me a name, but not a face. Imagine growing up disconnected from time, lineage, emotion. Imagine existing not as a person, but a control group, a variable. The stolen children weren't merely trafficked. They were processed, programmed, and positioned. Some were returned to society with new identities, placed into wealthy families, elite schools, influential positions, raised not as victims, but as vessels. You see them on your screens. You vote for them, you follow them, you marry them, and you never notice what's missing in their eyes. Not because they're hiding something, but because there's nothing there to hide. Just blank spaces designed by grief. The Hemlocks didn't disappear. They rebranded. The foundation was absorbed, the experiments privatized, and those who remember, silenced, institutionalized, or buried beneath their own rewritten memories. This isn't a conspiracy. It's an inheritance, and you may already be part of it. You've made it this far, That means something in you was always meant to hear this. Let's return to July 18, 2025. At exactly 3:17 a.m., an anonymous emergency dispatch was received in Charleston, West Virginia. A woman, breathless and disoriented, claimed to have escaped a locked underground corridor beneath what was now a historical memorial, the former Hemlock Foundation building. Her voice trembled as she described a room lined with silver cribs and humming refrigeration units that never stopped. Authorities responded, but by the time they arrived, the structure had already begun collapsing in on itself, a localized sinkhole, officially blamed on aging infrastructure and water erosion. No survivors, no caller, just a whisper on the line. And buried in the rubble, a single intact metal plaque, "In service to the future of the Appalachian child." Signed, Dr. Alistair Hemlock. That same week, multiple DNA databases across the country quietly rolled back their family connection services due to anomalous matches flooding the system. Matches between children born in the 1940s and living users who had no known ancestry in West Virginia. Matches no algorithm could explain. Then in the shadows of online forums, a pattern emerged. Users describing birthmarks shaped like the Hemlock family crest, unexplained memories of rooms with low lighting and a soft lullaby playing on loop, and dreams of a woman in a black nurse's uniform whispering, "They never meant for you to live, but you did." This isn't just a story about the past, it's a living wound. It's what happens when trust is weaponized, when compassion is commodified, and when the powerful rewrite the fate of the powerless. In basements, behind chapel walls, inside medical files that never saw daylight. Ask yourself, if a network like this existed once, could it still? And if babies were sold into new lives, stolen, renamed, rewritten, what becomes of a soul when its origin is erased? Some things we bury too deep, but eventually the ground remembers. Thank you for walking this corridor of truth with us. If this story shook something loose in you, comment "Unveiled Shadows" twice to lock in what you've uncovered. Subscribe to Unseen Rite and share this video if it made you question what lies beneath our institutions. Because in every forgotten file, every sealed room, a history like this waits for someone brave enough to find it.